So thanks, people, for joining us. Really appreciate you coming along to hear about this new thing called family and domestic violence leave. For those I haven't met or talked to before, I'm Naomi from Focus HR, and I've got the lovely Zoe Locke along with me as a co-facilitator on this. So Zoe is from a company called Catholic Care here in Toowoomba. They also have an arm called Business Resilience Centre, which does a lot of employer style services, particularly around employee assistance programs or EAPs, as well as workplace mediations. And so Zoe and I have worked quite a bit on this family and domestic violence leave concept because it very much has it's got two streams to it. One is the entitlement to the leave, which is the new legislated component to it. The other is how do businesses actually handle this? How do managers have these brand new conversations around things which are potentially really quite sensitive and very personal, which is where Zoe's skill set comes into play. So thanks, Zoe, for being here with us.
No worries, thank you for having me.
So what we're going to do in terms of the way that we'll structure it is we'll start off by going through the entitlement component, so that everyone is actually across what it is that that legislation has now brought into play. And then we're going to cover off on some of the people elements of how do we actually handle this. Just to put it into perspective, right from the word go, if you think that this is an issue that maybe won't affect you, I'm just going to challenge that in saying that the most recent statistics have told us that family and domestic violence affects 1 in 6 females and 1 in 16 males. It is not a female-only issue. It is both, but females are more frequently, I suppose, the victims in the situation. But 1 in 6 females. So even in a small workforce, statistically speaking, there is a chance of having someone who is in this situation. And having the family and domestic violence leave brought into legislation, the 10 paid days, means that there is a larger likelihood, I suppose, that employers will actually become aware of these situations where maybe previously we weren't. As employees start to come and say, this is my situation, I'd like to access that kind of leave. So that's why we think it's really, really important to understand what those entitlements are and how do we actually handle it when we have those conversations. So I'm going to share my screen. All right, we still good with the slides?
Yes. Excellent.
All right, so I'm going to dive into the detail around the legislation. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box. And Natalie, maybe if, just in case I miss seeing them come through, if you can interrupt me in between. Alternatively, at the end, when I've finished with my section, I'll check in if anyone's got any questions, and you can always bring yourselves off of mute to ask those. So the first thing to understand is that the time frame in which this legislation impacts businesses will change depending on whether you are a small or a large employer, according to Fair Work. So remember that large employers are employers who have 15 or more headcount of permanent employees. So for those businesses, this already came into play from the 1st of February. For small businesses, so 14 and less permanent headcount, this legislation comes into play from the 1st of August. So we've got a 6 months window before the paid family and domestic violence leave comes in. I want to cover some definitions to start with because it's really important to understand what constitutes family and domestic violence for the purpose of this leave. So the Fair Work Act now defines this as violent, threatening, or other abusive behaviour by a close relative, a member of an employee's household, or a current or former intimate partner of an employee that seeks to coerce or control the employee or causes the employee harm or to be fearful. And it can include things like physical, sexual, psychological, or economic abuse. Physical is the one that people think about most frequently when they're thinking about family and domestic violence leave. So it's important to understand that there are other streams as well. That middle bullet point is also really important. The behaviour needs to be by a a close relative, member of my household, or current or former intimate partner. It's not for situations where my neighbour has become abusive. That's not family and domestic violence leave. It needs to be one of those particular people that is perpetrating the violence or threatening or abusive behaviour for it to be under that definition for this particular type of leave. So if we just dive into that bullet point a little bit more, the definitions within that. So a close relative of an employee is someone who is a member of their immediate family or related to the employee according to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kinship rules. So that's a new part in this. We've never had that second bullet point before. So it's I guess acknowledging that we've got a different, or not a different, but an extended definition, let's say, when it comes to Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander kinship rules. So then immediate family in the first bullet point, it means spouse, de facto partner, child, parent, grandparent, grandchild, or sibling of the employee, or those same list of people of the spouse or de facto partner, so child, parent, grandparent, grandchild, or sibling of the person's spouse or de facto partner. It's a long list. The best way that I can give to think through that in a little bit of a logical fashion is I describe it as a cross. So it's the cross as in it's up, it's down, and it's straight across. So up from me is parents and grandparents, down from me is child and grandchildren, and across from me is brothers and sisters, so my siblings. It's not a star. So my uncles and aunties and my nieces and nephews typically aren't included in that definition of immediate family. So that's our definitions in terms of what family and domestic violence leave is and who the parties are that would be involved in it. So in relation to the actual entitlements, what is it that this new legislation brings into play? It's 10 days of paid leave each year. So an employee can take that leave if they're experiencing family and domestic violence and they need to do something to deal with the impact of that, and it's impractical to do it outside of work hours. So some really important components there. They need to be experiencing family and domestic violence. So it needs to hit that definition. And they need to be doing something to deal with the impact. It also needs to be impractical to do it outside of ordinary hours. So if you think about it, that naturally lends itself to things like needing to go and seek services from businesses that are only open during business hours, which might make it really impractical to do it outside of ordinary hours. We're not talking about things that they might be able to do on a weekend or during a lunch break or those sorts of things. It's genuinely my only option is to go and do this during work hours. It's impractical for me to do it otherwise. Keeping in mind too that impractical may well mean, look, even if that service is open on a weekend, I can't go then because it would be really obvious to the perpetrator that I'm going at that point in time. So examples of things like if they're making arrangements for their safety. So it could even be things like visiting real estate agents to look for alternative housing, or going and seeing support housing networks where they are looking to see, can I get a room in that house? It can be things like attending court hearings or accessing police services, all those things that you would, I guess, consider to be actions that help them to deal with the impact. In terms of the leave entitlements, this leave is really unusual. It is unlike any other kind of leave that we're used to, leave that accrues and those sorts of things. In this instance, the entitlement starts from day one. So as soon as an employee starts work with you, they have an entitlement to the family and domestic violence leave. It doesn't accrue. So if I don't use it this year, it doesn't mean I've got 20 next year. It's just 10 per year, and it resets on my anniversary of service. So whatever my start date was. This leave is also unusual in that it applies to casual employees as well as our full-time and part-timers. And that introduces a bit of an additional element around, well, what does it mean? What does a day even mean for the purpose of this leave? So Fair Work has defined that any hours that the employee was rostered to work that day, but was absent on family and domestic violence leave is what counts as a day. So if a part-timer was rostered for 5 hours and they take that off, that's a day. If a full-timer was rostered for 10 hours and takes that day off, that's the definition of a day. So it's any days or hours that normally would have been worked by a full-timer or a part-timer. For casual employees, it's any hours in the period that they were rostered to work. And this is where your rostering process can become particularly important in terms of the process you use for employees to tell you they're available. You offer them shifts, they accept shifts, because an employee is taken to have been rostered to work if they've been offered a shift and accepted that shift. As soon as that's happened, that's defined as, right, they were rostered to work that day. So if you'd offered them 10 hours for next week, Wednesday already, and they'd accepted that, and then sometime between now and next Wednesday, they let you know that, they need family and domestic violence leave, that would be considered as a period of time for which you would be paying them that leave. The reason why I say this brings into a higher degree of importance the process for rostering is that we know that there's a lot of businesses out there who might not do a formal rostering process. So there might not be a formal offer and acceptance process. And instead, it's just a given that casuals have got, for the next 3 months while we're in the busy season, you guys are working 10 hours a day. When that is in place, it would be really hard for an employer to have an employee say, I need family and domestic violence leave. And then for the employer to say, oh, look, well, next week, our next roster, we don't actually need you for that. Because if you are consistently giving them the hours without any kind of offer and acceptance process, I think Fair Work could probably look fairly dimly on anyone trying to say, no, we actually didn't roster them. So just something to keep in mind with that. When it comes to what is an employee's full pay rate, it's their base rate plus any incentive payments or bonuses, any loadings, monetary allowances, so leading hand, for example, in this case, if someone was was being paid leading hand, any overtime or penalty rates. So if you had someone that was rostered for 10 hours and that meant that they were paid 2 hours at time and a half, for example, that would be payable. And any other separately identifiable amounts. So if you think about it from a piece rate perspective, if you've got casuals who are on piece rate, you'd apply that same averaging of rate to get your base rate as what you would for if they were taking any kind of leave. Keep in mind too that employees can use other types of leave. So for permanents, they might want to use annual leave. They may also want to use personal carers leave instead. And I think one of the things that will be interesting to watch is how much people do actually apply for this leave. Because obviously, on the one hand, I know that there can be some skepticism, if we're being honest around will leave be used genuinely, or is this potentially going to be a big headache for employers? I suspect that there's also going to be a flip side, which will be there will be employees who do genuinely need this leave who may not actually even speak up or want to access it because they don't feel like it's something that they can discuss. So it may well be that they are using up annual leave or personal leave instead. There's also some circumstances in which personal leave entitlements actually apply instead of or in addition to family and domestic violence leave. So this is obviously just for permanent employees because casuals don't get paid personal leave, but an employee can use personal leave if they have an illness or personal injury. That's normal, right? That's what we use personal leave for. So we can use it if that happens because of a family or domestic violence situation. So an employee who has physical injuries or mental illnesses, for example, relating to family and domestic violence leave, they can use their personal leave for that situation. Similarly, unexpected emergency affecting a member of the employee's immediate household or family. So if just as an example, let's say it is a son in a household who is your employee and it's his mum who is subject to family and domestic violence leave and needs care, he may use that as the option he might use personal leave as the option to help take care of her. Can everyone still hear me? Yeah, awesome. I just wanted to
Yep.
check because my phone sometimes cuts me out. All right, so the other thing to be aware of is employees can request flexible working arrangements. So this is different again. So we've dealt with the leave component. The other thing that can happen in these situations is an employee coming to you and saying, this is my situation and I'd really appreciate some flexibility around my work. They might be asking for things like, I need changes in hours. So it might be relating to needing to pick kids up from school or needing to start later in the morning, something like that. They could be asking for a change in the pattern of work, in the location. I need to be moved somewhere else, or can I, even within the same building, work somewhere else? Or it might be changes to duties. I've come across ones where an employee has asked for a change in duties because they've said, look, with this thing going on for me, I actually can't focus on my high level role that I've got, but I really want to keep working. Is there a way that we can maybe remove some of my more stressful duties so that I can, keep things under control? So they could ask you for those sorts of flexible work arrangements. Now, this request is only for employees who have been with you for at least 12 months of service. So this doesn't start on day one. It does apply to casuals, but only casuals who are regular and systematic, have been for 12 months and have a reasonable expectation of continuing. So when that request happens, essentially it needs to be made in writing by the employee. The employer's obligation in that situation, so if someone does come to you and say, this is my situation and I would like to request flexible working arrangements, your first thing to do is ask them to put it into writing to you so that you can then consider what it is that they're wanting. And then the employer has an obligation to consider it, to consult with the employee. If it's not something that you can easily approve, you still need to have a conversation with them to talk about, well, what might work, what could happen. And you can only refuse on reasonable business grounds. And then you need to let them know within 21 days of receiving their request what your actual outcome is, whether you're approving it, whether you are offering them an alternative, or whether you're declining it. And if you're declining it, you've got to give your business reasons for that. The other point I just want to make with this is confidentiality. And in a moment, I'm going to cover notice requirements for family domestic violence leave and evidence. Really important to keep in mind with this that confidentiality with any employee information is crucial, but this in particular, it is such a sensitive situation. When we talk through the safety plan, you'll see that part of the conversation with an employee may need to be who else needs to know. There might be circumstances where we need to have that conversation, but as a whole, we need to be very careful that this is not disclosed to anyone without an employee's permission. One of the things that we're recommending is even when you do get evidence that an employee needs to access this leave, that you cite the evidence. And if you want to, tick a box on a form that says that you have actually cited that evidence, but not necessarily keeping a copy of it on file, because that information could become out of date. If your filing practices or your computer systems aren't 100% secure, it's just such a risk of breaching confidentiality if we keep that stuff on file. The other really practical element in all of this is payslips. So Fair Work only just recently, so they released this new legislation a couple of months ago, but just recently they've come out to confirm how payslips need to record family and domestic violence leave. So it is not allowed, you cannot have on a payslip anything relating to family and domestic violence leave for leave taken. You also don't put their balance on the payslip. So if someone has had 3 days leave, you don't show a balance of 7. That would need to be a verbal. If an employee needs to check about, well, how much have I still got, they'll need to ask that question. In terms of how you can record it, Fair Work is essentially saying that in future, because there's a 4-month grace period at the moment, but in future, it will be recorded as ordinary hours because that way it can't be identified. Because remember, if they're in this situation, there's a high degree of likelihood that there's controlling behaviours from the other party, which means that they may well be looking at their pay slips or checking their emails or those sorts of things. So if there's anything on that pay slip which shows that it could be something unusual, it's going to raise some questions or raise some red flags. So it will get processed to be shown as ordinary hours. It can also be shown as any other kind of payment for performance, or it can be shown as leave if the employee requests for it to be shown as leave. Now, what your payroll providers are madly scrambling to do right now is make sure that their payroll systems can actually do this part of it. So the ones that we are aware of already, they are in the process of looking at how can we have it that on a pay slip, it might show 38 ordinary hours, but in the background, of course, the employer needs to be able to see, well, that was actually 30 hours of ordinary hours worked and 8 hours of family and domestic violence leave. Because you will still need to be able to, you know, in the background, hidden from the actual payslip, of course, you need to be able to see where they've taken that leave. So they are all, I imagine, in the process of trying to figure out exactly how to make that work. During the 4-month grace period, if your payroll provider doesn't yet have that set up, stick with that idea of processes it as ordinary hours, or you know, you might have ordinary hours 1 that just helps to distinguish that that's what it is, or you might put it down as just straight leave. Don't write special leave or anything like that, but it might just be leave so that it's not distinguishable. One of the things I do want to raise, and it's really important that your people are aware of this, and Zoe is going to talk in a moment around not becoming an accidental counsellor or needing to actually provide support to these people in terms of how to deal with family and domestic violence leave. That's not your role as an employer. It's not your role as a manager. So it's actually really important to be across the supports options that are out there. Now there is a kit available now on the GrowCom shop. It has a policy in it, and in that policy is a list of the potential support services. There's more than this out there, but these are the ones that we know have a involvement in family and domestic violence leave. The last one there, the EAP service, this is one that normally you would have. So if you have it available, you as the employer have that set up. They are just so invaluable. We have a Business Resilience Centre for ours. It's a great option to have where you can say to an employee who is struggling with something, hey, listen, don't forget you can call the EAP service and get some independent support with that from people who are actually trained at counselling and trained at helping people to work through issues, whether they're work related or personal. So if you don't already have an EAP in place, I'd seriously recommend it. It's such a good support system, particularly for situations like this. So one of the most frequently asked questions, and I've left it until now, reasonable evidence. Employers are asking, if someone comes to me and says that they need family and domestic violence leave, how do I tell if it's genuine? How do I know? And Zoe's going to talk to you in a little bit about the sorts of signs that might tell you anyway. But just in terms of what you're allowed to ask for, Fair Work has been incredibly helpful, as they always are, and basically said that there's no set definition on or clear guidelines on what reasonable evidence might be, but it needs to be, or it can be, evidence that could convince a reasonable person. So this is where you put your reasonable person hat on and you think, well, what would convince me that this person is indeed taking genuine family and domestic violence leave? So it could be things like documents issued by a police service or a court. It doesn't need to be a letter to the employer. It could be that the employee brings in their statement that they gave to the police and it shows the date and time on it. So it's clear that they were there during work hours. It could be family violence support service documents. So the screen we showed you before that had the different support centres, it might be that they do have a letter from or some sort of a statement from one of those support services to state that the employee had been there. Could be letters from other service providers. So if they are, for example, looking at relocating to move to a safer place, it could be that they have a letter from a real estate stating that they were with them that day and that they were looking at other housing options. Of course, it can be a doctor's certificate. And I believe we're allowed to ask that the doctor's certificate does say that it's for family domestic violence leave purposes. Normally, doctor's certificates are very bland and they are just a straight unfit for work. That is acceptable for personal leave situations, but you're allowed to ask for evidence to convince a reasonable person that this is for family and domestic violence leave. So I think it's reasonable to say that it needs to state that it's for that purpose. Doesn't need any more detail than that, but it's evidence that this particular leave is needed as opposed to personal leave, or it can be a stat dec. Now, if an employee doesn't provide evidence, so if you've had an employee come to you and say, this is my situation, and you've shown the appropriate level of support to them, you've also asked them, as you can do, to provide you with their reasonable evidence to help you to process the payment, and they don't provide it to you, it is the same as other sorts of leave, like personal leave, in that if you don't receive the reasonable evidence, you don't have to process it as paid leave. So it would just be unpaid leave in that instance. Of course, you're going to have a think about whether or not you want to do that and how far you would push that. But technically speaking, if you don't receive the evidence, you don't have to process it as paid leave. If you don't receive the evidence and you've got reason to believe that it's not genuine, which again, I know sounds very skeptical, but I know that this is a concern that is in employers' minds. If you are concerned about that, again, you treat it like you would any other kind of leave, in that if you had an employee who claimed that they were sick and you had reason to believe that they weren't, you would be looking at, investigations may be a heavy word, but you would be looking for, do I have evidence that shows me that this is not genuine? If you discover that it is not, then you would go down the right paths in terms of dealing with that in a really fair and thorough process. The other thing that is going to come is that all of the existing enterprise agreements or collective agreements out there will be updated to make sure that they do include the family and domestic violence leave. So if you've got an EA already in place and it has anything less than 10 days worth of paid family and domestic violence leave, just be aware that the 10 days takes precedent. If you have an EA already in place and it gives 20 days, the 20 days sticks. So if you're already more generous than that, it stays in place. All right. I just want to move on to the workplace safety component, because this is the other thing that comes to mind for employers. And we've actually helped a number of employers even before this leave came out to navigate this. So put yourself in these shoes. You have an employee who works, let's say, in back office or in the workshop or the shed, and they come to you and they share with you that they're in this situation, that they have a physically violent partner, and they're really concerned for their safety. They just want you to know so that you're aware of it if they're a little bit under the weather or lacking attention and all of those sorts of things. And that's effectively what they come to you for. When you start to think that through, you start to think about, well, is there a chance that that person will come to the workplace? If they do, who's the first person they see? Well, that's going to be reception. So should reception know about this? And if reception's going to know about it, how will they know how to identify the person? And is there actually a risk to anyone else in my workplace? You can see how these things start to, when you think about some scenarios, you start to see that this can also be a bigger impact than just the individual themselves. And of course, as an employer, you've got workplace safety obligations. And those obligations are both to the individual who you're dealing with at that exact point in time, but also to the other people in the workforce. So our recommendation is that you handle that process through a workplace safety plan when you have someone who is letting you know that they're in a family and domestic violence situation. And that particular plan, and it's part of the kit that's on the GrowCom shop, by the way, it helps you to ask the right questions from the employee to understand the situation that they're in. When you're doing that plan, what we're suggesting you do is you're understanding the background from the employee. You're asking, are there any court orders or police orders or anything like that already in place? Because if that's the case, it's good for us to know. Because if there's anything that has any of the kind of restraints around what distance the person can come within, and they come to the workplace, good for the employer to know if there's already an order in place. You might also be asking them at that point, have they already gone to report things to the police? And if not, maybe it's something that you assist them to do. And then you'd be having the conversation around, look, have there been any threats of physical violence? Have there been any threats of physical violence at work? And if there have been threats of physical violence coming into the workplace, then we probably need to have a bit of a chat around who needs to know here. Again, respecting privacy entirely. But if someone is in that situation where their partner has said, I am coming to your workplace and there's actually a threat, that's a safety risk that the employer needs to help work through. How do we actually manage that here? You'd be talking to them about, are there any dates or any plans that you already have in place? So if they're going through the court system, it's very possible they already know the dates that they're going to be needed in the courts. And that way, at least you're pre-planning around when they're going to be away rather than being reactive. And then the conversation is around, look, how else can we support? And so you might be talking with them about, is their work location suitable? So in an office environment, for example, is their desk situated near a window where they're easily visible? Do they work out in reception where they're easily accessible to the public? Like, what is their actual work location and how secure is it? In your environment, it could well be, are they ever in an environment where they are working alone in a packing shed or alone in a field? Because that might be something that you want to have a think about. What are their hours of work? You might be thinking about things like if they have long hours or they work into the evening and they finish after dark, is there any safety risk there? You might talk about whether or not you need to screen calls or visitors. So, sometimes people will say, look, if my partner does ring here, can you just say that I'm not available? We've got a lot of clients actually who are starting to put just general good practice in place where when a phone call comes in, they're not saying, oh, hi, Scott, Naomi's out at Tilly's at the moment. She'll give you a call when she's back. So they're not actually telling people where the employees are. They're simply saying, look, they're not available right now. I'll get them to give you a call back, just so that we're protecting privacy in general. You might think about the process of an employee arriving at or leaving from work. So if it's a long walk to the car park, if that's normally done by themselves, is there anything around that can be done to keep them safer? You might also think about who to contact. So quite often when someone starts with you and they fill out their employee details form, they'll have a section which is, who do you contact in case of emergency? Now that could well be their life partner. If it then eventuates that person is the person perpetrating some sort of family and domestic violence, it might be that we need to change those contact details. And you might also think about parking and travel arrangements. Now, I just want to find, we've got a little video here which helps to give you a bit of an idea on how that conversation might look, because it can be a little bit daunting to think about even having this conversation. So I'll play it for you.
Thanks for telling me about the restraining order you have against your partner. Let's chat about what we can do to make you feel safe at work.
My partner calls me at work a lot. It scares me.
We can arrange to screen your calls. And should we change your emergency contact to someone other than your partner?
Yes. Please use my friend Chris. Sometimes I get nervous walking to my car alone.
We'll get security to walk you to your car. Would you like a parking spot closer to the building?
That would help me feel safer too.
You work near the main entrance. It would be safer to move you to a different area.
Thank you.
So this is the restraining order, right? I'm going to share this with security.
Okay, but does that mean everyone will know?
This will be kept confidential. Only those who need to know for safety reasons will be told.
What should I do if my partner threatens to come here and hurt me?
We have a workplace safety plan to deal with threats of violence. Let's go over it.
So I know not all of that is practical to put in place for every single business, but the point is having a conversation around what are some of the practical measures, and that conversation being with the employee is what's really important. It helps them to feel supported. It helps them to feel like you are genuinely caring for their safety, and it means as an employer that you're putting reasonable steps into place. All right, so that's the legislation and some of the safety considerations. Now, Zoe's going to jump on next, but just quickly to check, is there any specific questions around that legislation side of things? Has there been any come up in the chat? No.
There's been none in the chat, no.
All right, if anyone wants to come off mute, feel free to, but otherwise. All right, Zoe, I think I might have numbed all of their minds. So we're going to hand over to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Naomi. And feel free to put any questions you might have in the chat too. I will keep an eye as I'm talking through. Naomi, if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what we know is that domestic violence doesn't stop when the employee comes to work. We know if there are personal issues happening for someone at home, that they inevitably enter into the workplace in one way or the other. We know that they can impact the way people present at work, their engagement with colleagues, their engagement with clients, and also their productivity. So what is really important is that we start to recognise what those impacts might be in a broad scale, and what kind of support you as a manager in your organisation can provide to someone as they come to you and talk, maybe raise these issues that they're having. The most important thing really is when someone comes to you, the initial response is really to be supportive and caring. It's okay if you don't know any information about family and domestic violence, if you don't understand it, if you don't really know how to respond. And sometimes it's okay to simply say that, to be reassuring. Listen is the most important thing, but also don't feel like you have to know all the answers and exactly what the next steps are. Obviously, the policy and the process and the safety plan that Focus HR have provided will give you those guidelines. But make sure in your initial response not to feel like you have to answer all the questions then. Make sure you take it seriously. So it's really important. It's really hard for people to disclose information, and it's not necessarily the first thing people do. What you may find is people are more likely to use their personal leave or their annual leave or keep the situation quiet. So sometimes it can take a fair bit of courage for someone to disclose that this really significant situation is occurring for them in their life. So it's really about some simple principles. Be reassuring, make them know that that's obviously the violence isn't their fault, acknowledge how hard it can be for them to come and talk to you and to kind of expose that or talk about that in their workplace. And then start to talk to them about options. And it's okay if you don't remember what those options are to say, well, I know we have this process, go and have a look at the policy, I will go and have a look, and then we can come back and have a further conversation. But what the safety plan really does, and the policy, is step you through what the process is and how you might respond. One of the most important things we're recommending is that you suggest to your employee that they go and seek support, that you're not expected to provide all that support. So we're saying be supportive, but have boundaries. Don't feel like you need to rescue or you need to solve all the problems. There are professionals who do this. It is a very complex area. You're not expected to be able to interpret a domestic violence order or a child protection order or what any of that means. It's really important that those people go and seek professional support, and then kind of you can have a conversation about what's the engagement at work for that person and how much you support them when they're at work to make sure they're safe. And really, the final thing is probably just to make sure that when you're engaging with someone, just to kind of keep a calm and reassuring tone, because people who experience family and domestic violence are often in a really hypervigilant state, which means that they're very anxious and probably kind of on edge, that sense of walking on eggshells. So being really calm and reassuring is really helpful when someone comes and discloses it, because most often they will be quite nervous and feeling uneasy about needing to talk about that. In terms of signs, how do you know when someone is experiencing family and domestic violence? Well, there can be a whole range of signs, and there's always a spectrum. What is important is to understand that sometimes the signs can be significant and sometimes they can be subtle. So think about things like sometimes it is really obvious and there are physical signs of abuse, but what we know is that more prevalent forms of family and domestic violence is that coercive controlling violence, which is the things where people are stopped from seeing family members or stopped from going to events or controlled, or they're controlled about what they can wear or what they can do or who they can talk to. So it is not always that traditional sense of I will see a black eye and then I will know that that is what is occurring. Often it can come through in terms of their behaviour, being very anxious, being sad, lonely or withdrawn, not being able to make decisions or needing to seek permission from their partner, engaging in fewer social activities. Sometimes it can be a change. So someone who experiences family and domestic violence, that doesn't mean that that is their entire relationship. Sometimes there are times in the relationship where they would be feeling positive about the relationship. So sometimes it can be shifts in behaviours, and family and domestic violence is often a cycle, which means that there can be times when it is more dangerous for someone and times when they kind of are in that recovery mode or that honeymoon phase, or when seemingly the relationship seems good. That doesn't mean that the control and coercive behaviours aren't still occurring, but it's not always experienced on a day-to-day or a moment-by-moment basis by that person. So it is really important to understand that there can be a huge range of signs and a big spectrum in terms of what does that kind of look like. There's not a tick box to identify exactly when is someone experiencing this. So continuing, we also know that there can be kind of indicators that often impact on someone's their conduct at work, sorry. So some of the things that we can see are unexplained absences, or someone regularly turning up late, being really chaotic, needing to pop out all the time for appointments. And sometimes we initially kind of think that there's a productivity or a performance plan that's needed to put in place. Sometimes this can be the result of all the things that are going on at home. So it's really important that we can start to have some of those conversations and really be curious and ask questions. It can be lots of excessive personal calls, being really distracted or unmotivated. And often it's that uncharacteristic drop in performance. So a change, something that significantly changes. You've had an amazing work, an employee, and all of a sudden their performance changes. Often that is an indicator that something is happening for that person in their personal life. That's not always family and domestic violence, but it is one of the indicators. It is important that should you have someone, we've talked about to a lot of employers about when someone is already undergoing a performance improvement plan, or you're already monitoring their performance, and then this situation arises in terms of them disclosing. What's probably really important is that sometimes that's a point of reset. So it may be that you need to continue managing or talking about the performance-related issues, but it also means that there might be other things going on in their personal life that are impacting. So it's probably important when these things are raised that you kind of stop the performance conversation and also have the space to be able to have another conversation that is really about the support that can be provided. You can still be clear about expectations and also be open about the impacts on work. But if you can have that more supportive conversation, sometimes you can work towards what are some of the things that the flexible arrangements or the changes that you need maybe to assist in improving that work performance. Again, it's always a spectrum, so and every situation is so different, but it's just really important to have that in your back of your mind, because sometimes when engaging someone in a performance improvement plan and this kind of situation is going on in the background, it can spiral out of control very quickly. So it's important to kind of stop and reset and really identify what is the situation and what is occurring. Naomi, I don't know if you want to expand in that area at all.
Yeah, I guess just from our observation, we've certainly seen it where we will be, like an employer will be a fair way into a performance management process with an employee, because those signs have been there for quite some time. And of course, you know, proactive employers would be starting to do performance management. And so they might be into, you know, a formal warning, sometimes even a final warning stage before an employee feels like, gosh, I'm going to lose my job. I have to say something, because I don't think it's unusual that until that point in time, they would rather keep that situation private. So that can be really challenging for the employer to do this mental backflip almost from, I've got an employee who's underperforming. They're not responding to any of the performance management. I can't believe they're not doing their job. All that kind of almost negative mindset, to all of a sudden having to backflip and go, hang on a second, this person's just told me the reason why this is happening, and I now need to switch gears, and I need to. I'm not saying you have to stop the process 100%. That's not it. You can still expect a good level of performance and the right level of behaviour from an employee, but it certainly shifts how you handle the situation and your approach to the employee. And that can be a challenge. So yeah.
Thank you. So one of the hardest things in this situation is knowing how to have the conversation, particularly if it's not an area that you're comfortable or you know a lot of information about. So in terms of starting the conversation, just find a safe and private place. So don't have the conversation in public. Don't kind of ask the question in the hallway. Make sure you have a private space where you can kind of start and engage in that conversation. Ask open-ended conversations. So don't necessarily ask, are you experiencing family and domestic violence, or is your partner hurting you? You know, really ask open-ended questions such as, you know, is there anything that might be impacting on your work? Is there a way that we might be able to support you? You might be aware of this new legislation and that there are options around leave. Kind of being really calm and curious about the questions that you're asking. If you are to share some observations, so you might say, you know, I have noticed that you're frequently late to work, or that you're needing to pop out, or you seem distracted. You know, is there some support that you're needed? Try to not be non-judgmental, or use that language that isn't as judgmental when you're talking with them, rather than saying, you know, your performance has dropped. This is a really big issue. What's the problem? You know, you can kind of see the difference in terms of the language. And sometimes we think in a conversation we have to talk, but silence can be really important too. So don't be afraid to ask a question, and sometimes name, look, I'm feeling I've got to have a difficult conversation. I'm not really sure how to have that. I'm trying to be respectful. Let me know if you've got any concerns. Sometimes just opening up and being a little bit vulnerable and letting people know that you too are not 100% kind of confident in the conversation can really invite people to respond and, I guess, engage back and let you know really what's going on. Be prepared for an emotional response. And in saying that, you may have someone who becomes very emotive and gets very upset and sad and cries, but sometimes there are emotions that you don't expect. So some of those emotions can be defensiveness, anger, you know, and kind of those more abrupt behaviours. Because whilst you might be ready to have that conversation, that doesn't mean that other person who might be experiencing the violence is ready to. They are also in a relationship where the person closest to them is being abusive. So for them, close relationships aren't always safe. So any relationship obviously can kind of be concerning. They're always at that kind of hypervigilant stage. So they're going to be really anxious about things anyway. What can also happen is when someone doesn't respond in a way that you think I'm engaging in a conversation, I'm being really caring, kind of expect a nice response back. When that doesn't happen, the trouble is you can get triggered. And obviously, as a manager, we have some additional responsibilities in terms of how we engage. And sometimes you don't even expect that trigger. There are people we just come in contact with who kind of make us react in a way that we don't really always understand why. So it is really important to kind of know when you're going into one of these difficult conversations, one, they may not respond. They may not even be kind. They may not be thankful that you're raising these things. They might be abrupt and rude and all of those kind of things. But really not to take that personally, and then to be really aware of ways you might be triggered. And it's important to then be able to go away and debrief with someone that is in your workforce, that's an appropriate person, a colleague, another manager, or your supervisor, and kind of talk about what that's about. The most important thing is really to listen and not to give advice. So it's really important in these situations not to say, oh, yes, I knew it and you should just leave. This is ridiculous. These are the kind of things you should do. Because the ability for someone to leave a family and domestic violence relationship isn't just about practical things. There's a whole range of practical stuff, and there can be a whole range of control around finances and things, but it can be a really emotional thing, and it's a cycle. So although someone might know what they need to do or think they might need to do, it is a cycle. When you're disclosing a really personal thing, immediately getting advice is often kind of not well received. Here's another little video that kind of gives you an indication of maybe how not to have the conversation, and then an idea about actually how could you have the conversation, what is that kind of like? And it just reiterates some of the things we've been talking about.
Alex, I'm worried about you. You're a great worker, but lately you seem distracted.
Is it okay to talk about my personal problems at work?
If you tell me what's wrong, maybe I can help.
I didn't want to bring it up at work, but my partner is hurting me at home.
That's so hard to believe.
Does my boss think I'm lying?
How do you put up with this?
Does he think it's my fault?
You should leave your partner.
If only it were that easy.
Alex, I'm worried about you. You're a great worker, but lately you seem distracted. If you tell me what's wrong, maybe I can help.
I didn't want to bring it up at work, but my partner is hurting me at home.
Oh, no. I'm sorry to hear that. Would you like to talk about it?
Is there any point in talking about this at work?
We have policies that can help keep you safe at work.
It would be such a relief to feel safe while I'm here.
Look, here's a list of resources for people dealing with domestic violence. I'm here to listen anytime, okay? You're not alone.
Maybe there is hope.
So that just gives you an example of how not to do it and how you can start to do it. I will move through these next couple of slides because I'm aware of time. So in terms of starting the conversation, it might be about referring back to your policy. As you know, at a recent staff presentation, we've had some changes to leave entitlements regarding family and domestic violence, and then talk to them about what you value. You're such a great employee. You've been here for this period of time. We really value you. However, these are the things we've noticed. You seem more distracted and upset. And acknowledge that we know that actually things that happen in everyone's life impact their work. This idea that work and life are separate, we know isn't actually the way the world works. So really talking about their value and then saying, look, I'm concerned and I wanted to check in with you and see if you need any support. Sometimes it's about planting the seed, and people may not always disclose in that immediate conversation. They might need to go away and come back and have a further conversation. So a few things to avoid. Be careful about what your line is. Know what your boundaries are. Your role is to be supportive, but you definitely need to have boundaries. That is incredibly important, and you still need to be professional. Avoid giving personal advice. So we don't want to give personal advice in terms of their relationship. We don't want to criticize their partner. Oh, I knew that your partner was like that. I knew that. Or yes, they're a terrible person. You should leave. Because as we said, in terms of that cycle, they may leave and they may return. And that's why it's so important to have those boundaries as well, because the reality is people leave the relationship and they go back into the relationship as well. So kind of sharing your opinion can further ostracize that person. As we saw in the video, don't kind of seem to disbelieve what they're saying or be overly emotional or invested in what they're telling you. So don't say things like, oh, that's hard to believe, things get better with time, or those kind of generic statements like, oh, I'm sure it'll be all right, or I'm sure it's not that bad, you have to leave them, all of those things. And in terms of taking care of yourself, I guess it's also really important to know not to offer your house or your spare room, or not to jump in and kind of be that saviour. So what we talk about is you're not expected to be a domestic violence expert, you're not expected to be a counsellor, and you're not expected to be a saviour or to resolve all their problems. Some of us kind of have that kind of saviour, wanting to help everyone complex. It's including myself. It's really good to have those boundaries still in terms of saying, well, what's my role? It is still a professional role. How do I support you, but know what the boundaries are? So be careful not to wear those hats. Make sure you're make sure that you're referring them to an EAP service where they can then get some support and some individual counselling, and to also kind of refer to those professionals in the field. Your role is to be supportive, not to be judgmental, to guide them. So it's really about we're referring to your policy and talking them through what are the 3 next steps that they need to do. Make sure you reach out to your management, reach out to the Business Resilience Centre or to Focus HR if you need. Every situation is really different, and it's important that you have a good baseline in terms of understanding how you might deal with these things, and then knowing who are the services I need to connect with when this might happen. So some general things that Naomi already started to kind of touch on is do talk with your leadership team about how you might practically manage this in the workplace. Naomi gave a really good example about how you can manage it at reception at the front end in terms of the information you provide. It's good to have the proactive conversation, because then when someone comes and discloses this or a situation arises, you're more prepared rather than having to be reactive and have not thought about what it might look like. The video kind of talked about all the safety plan options that you can do. Not everyone has a security guard who can walk someone to their car. So those practical things are really important to think about. What can we manage in our workplace? And you're clear about the necessary lines of communication. Should someone disclose, who does need to know? What does that privacy and confidentiality look like? And should we have to disclose to other people, or should reception need to be made aware? How are we best going to do those things, and what are our lines of communication? We've talked about the general kind of workplace rules. Make sure you advise employees of the changes. So we're suggesting to either write an email, have a discussion at your staff meeting, or do both really. That verbal and written is a really good way to give people information so they know what they're entitled to and can access it. Because we know that people experiencing this, it's already impacting their work. What the hope is for this kind of leave is it actually allows people to go away, get the support they need, and then be able to come back into the workplace and be more productive and continue in terms of their working kind of needs, rather than always being distracted and really only doing a half job, and then you needing to go down those performance management processes. And really review the skills and needs of your employees and your management team. What information do we know? Do we have links? Have we contacted places like DVAT? Do we have any brochures on hand? What are the things that we might need to know? And what's our limitation? Actually, we really don't know how to have these conversations. Do we need some training? Or when this comes up, who would we call to get some support? Because it's really important when it comes up that you are able to have a supportive, engaged conversation to really make sure that the process works well for you and for the employee.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Zoe. But that covers it. We have, we're 2 minutes over, but we raced through that. Now, are there any questions at all? Please feel free to bring yourself off of mute if you would like to ask a question, or alternatively put it in the chat box, or you can, of course, if you need support on this or need to understand things a little better, you can also ring in through the GrowCom or the Hawke Queensland support line as well.